Chapter 5, Part 1 of The Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 5, Part 1. It's the life of Riley, Paul. Ramos was beaming back to Jarviston, Minnesota, not many hours after Frank Nelson, GIMP Hines, and he started out from the moon with their ultimate destination after the delivery of their loads of supplies to the Cossacks, tentatively marked in their minds as Palestine, on Pallas, the golden asteroid. Ramos was riding a great bale, drawn by his spinning and still accelerating ring, to the hub of which it was attached by a thin steel cable passed through a well-oiled swivel bolt. One of his booted feet was hooked under a bale lashing to keep him from drifting off in the absence of weight. He held a rifle casually, but alert, across his knees. Its needle-like bullets were not intended to kill. They were tiny rockets that could flame during the last second of a long flight, honing in on a target by means of a self-contained and marvelously miniaturized radar guidance system. Their tips were anesthetic. The parabolic antenna, mounted on the elbow of Ramos's Archer, swung a tiny bit, holding the beam contact with Paul Hendricks automatically after it was made. Yet Ramos kept his arm very still to avoid making the slender beam swing wide. Meanwhile, he was elaborating on his first statement. "Not like before, no terrestrial ground-to-orbit weight problems to beat, this trip, Paul. And we've got some of about everything that the moon could provide, thanks to GIMP, who paid the bill. Culture steaks in the shadow refrigerators. That's all you need out here to keep things frozen, just a shadow. We've got hydroponic vegetables, tinned bread, chocolate, beer. We've got sun stoves to cook on. We've got numerous luxury items not meant for the stomach. We're living high for a while, anyhow. Of course, we don't want to use up too much of the fancy stuff. Tell Otto Kramer about us." Frank Nelson and GIMP Hines, who were riding the riggings of their respective bubs, which were also hauling big bales of supplies, were part of the trans-spatial conversation, too. There was enough leakage from Ramos's Titan beam here at its source for them to hear what he said. But when after a moment Paul Hendricks answered from the distance, "Easy with the talk, fella. Over-interested people might be listening," they suddenly forgot their own enthusiasms. They realized their hides tingled unpleasantly. Ramos's dark face hardened. Still he spoke deprecatingly. "Shucks, Paul. This is a well-focused beam. Besides, it's pointing earthward and sunward, not toward the belt, where most of the real mean folks are." But he sounded defensive, and very soon he said, "Bye for now, Paul." A little later, Frank Nelson contacted Art Cusack out in the asteroid belt, across a much greater stretch of space. He thought he was cautious when he said, "We're riding a bit heavy for you guys." But after the 20-minute interval it took to get an answer back over 10 light minutes of distance, traversed twice, 186,000 miles for every second, spanned by slender threads of radio energy which were of low power but of low loss, low dispersal too, explaining their tremendous range, Art Cusack's warning was carefully cryptic yet plain to Nelson and his companions. "Thanks for all the favors," he growled dryly. "Now keep still and be real thoughtful, Frankie boy. That also goes for you other two naive boneheads." Open space, like open, scarcely touched country, had produced its outlaws, but the distances were far greater. The pressures of need were infinitely harsher. "Yeah, there's a leader named Fesler," GIMP rasped, with his phone turned low so that only his companions could hear him. "But there are other names. Art's right. We'd better keep our eyes open and our mouths shut." Asteroid miners who had had poor luck, or who had been forced to kill to win even the breath of life, colonists who had left Mars after terrible misfortunes there, adventurers soured and maddened by months in a vacuum armor, smelling the stench of their own unwashed bodies, men flush with gains and seeking merely to relieve the tension of their restrained artificial existences in a wild spree Refugees from rigid Tovey conformism. All these composed the membership of the wandering, robbing, hijacking bands which, though not numerous, were significant. Once, most of these men had been reasonably well-balanced individuals, easily lost in a crowd, but the big vacuum could change that. Ramos, Hines, and Nelsen had heard the stories. Now their watchfulness became almost exaggerated. They felt their inexperience. They made no more radio beam contacts. One of them was always on lookout, clutching a rifle, peering all around, glancing every few seconds at the miniaturized radar screen set inside the collar of his helmet. But the spherical sky remained free of any unexplained blips or luminous speck. Fragments of conversation picked up in their phones, widely separated asteroid miners talking to each other for the most part, obviously came from far away. There was a USSF bub cruising a few million miles off. Otherwise, the enormous emptiness was safely and perversely empty all around. They kept accelerating. For a planned interval, they enjoyed all the good things. They found that masculine guardedness and laziness went well together. They ate themselves full. Like Mitch Story had once done, they all started hydroponic gardens inside their bubs. In the pleasant, steamy sun warmth of those stellene interiors, they bounced back and forth from elastic wall to elastic wall, with gravity temporarily at zero because they had stopped the spin of their bubs. Thus, they loosened their muscles, worked up a sweat. Afterwards, they dozed, slept, listened to beamed radio music or taped recordings of their own. They smiled at pin-up pictures, read microfilmed books through a viewer, looked at the growing plants around them. There was an arrogance in them because they had succeeded in bringing so much of home out here. There was even a mood like that of a lost, languid beach in the tropics. And how was that possible, with only a thin skin of stellene between them and frigid nothing? Ramos said just about what he had said long ago, it seemed now. Nuts. The big vacuum ain't so tough. But he amended quickly. Yeah, I know, Frank. Don't scowl. When you aren't looking, it can up and kill you. Like with my Uncle Jose, only worse. He was a powder monkey in Mexico. It got so he thought dynamite was his friend. Well, there wasn't even anything to put in his coffin. The luxurious interlude passed, and they reverted mostly to Spartan meals of space gruel, except for some fresh-grown lettuce. Mars became an agate bead, then a hazy sphere, with those swirled, almost fluid markings where the spores of perhaps sentient vegetable life followed the paths of thin winds, blowing equatorwards from the polar caps of hoarfrost. The 3 stellene rings bumped lightly on the 10-mile chunk of captured asteroid rock and nickel iron that was Phobos, Mars' nearer moon. Gravitation was almost nil. There was no need here for rockets to land or take off. The sun-powered ionics were more than enough. A small observatory, a UN-tended between ground and orbit rocket port, and a few hydroponic garden domes nestled in the jaggedness were all that Phobos had, other than the magnificent view of the red planet below. Gimp Hines' freckled face shone in the ruddy light. "I'm going down," he declared, "just for a few days, to look around near the survey station. You guys?" Ramos shrugged, almost disinterested. "People have been there, some still are, and what good is poking around the station? But who wants to goof up, going into the thickets? Others have done that, often enough. Me for Palestine, and maybe lots further, pal." Frank Nelsen wasn't that blasé. On the Moon, he had seen some of the old Mars of advanced native technology, now long extinct. But there was also the recent Mars of explorers, and then footloose adventurers wondering what they could find to do with this quiet, pastel-tinted world of tremendous history. They had come, the colonists, with their tractors and their rolls of stellene, to make sealed dwellings and covered fields in that thin, almost oxygenless atmosphere. But their hopes to find peace and isolation from the crowded and troubled Earth by science and hard work, even in so harsh a place, had come into conflict with a third Mars that must have begun soon after the original inhabitants had been destroyed, though maybe it had had its start billions of years before on the planets of another star. The thickets had seemed harmless. Was this another different civilization that had risen at last in anger, using its own methods of allergy, terrible repellent nostalgia, and mental distortions? Frank felt the call of mystery, which was half dread. But then he shrugged. Gimp. I'd like to go down too, but the gravity is twice that of the moon, and getting up and down isn't so easy. Besides, once when I made a stopover in space after a nice short hop, I got into trouble. I'll pass this one up. I'd like to talk to Mitch Storey, though. They all tried to reach him, beaming the survey station at the edge of Citrus Major, the great equatorial wedge of blue-green growths on the floor of a vanished ocean, first. Mitch Storey is not around right now, a young man's voice informed them. He wandered off again 3 days ago. Does it often. No, we don't know where to reach him. Widening their beams over the short range of considerably less than 4,000 miles, they tried to call Mitch directly. No luck. Contact should have been easy, but of course he could be wandering with his Archer helmet phone turned off. Considering the reputation of Mars, Nelsen was a bit worried, but he had perhaps a treacherous belief that Mitch was special enough to take care of himself. Ramos was impatient. "We'll hook old Mitch on our party line sometime, Frank," he said. "Right now we ought to get started. Space is still nice and empty ahead, towards the Kuzaks and Palestine. That condition might not last. Gimp, are you honest-to-gosh set on going down to this dried-up museum world?" "Uh-huh. See you soon, though," Gimp answered, grinning. "I'll leave my bub and my load of supplies up here on Phobos. Be back for it in probably a week. And there'll be a freight bub cluster or something for me to join up with and follow you out." Nelsen and Ramos left Gimp Hines before he boarded the winged skip-glide rocket that would take him below. Parting words flew back and forth. "See ya, take care. Over the Milky Way, suckers." Then they were standing off from Mars and its 2 moons. During the next several Earth days of time, they accelerated with all the power that their bub ionics could wring out of the sunshine, weakened now with distance. They knew about where to find the Kuzaks, but contact was weeks off. When they were close enough, they could radio safely, checking the exact position of Art and Joe's supply post. And they knew enough to steer clear of Ceres, the largest asteroid, which was Tovie occupied. All the signs were good. They were well armed and watchful. They should have made the trip without trouble. Ahead, dim still with distance, but glinting with a pinkish metallic shine which made it much brighter than it would otherwise have been, was Pallas, which Ramos watched like a beacon. "El Dorado," he said once, cockily, as if he remembered something from the Spanish part of his background. They got almost 3/4 across that unimaginable stretch of emptiness before there was a bad sign. It was a cat call, literally, in their helmet phones. Meow. It was falsely plaintive and innocuous. It was a maliciously childish promise of trouble. A little later there was a chuckle. "Be cavalier, fellas. Watch yourselves. I mean it." The tone had a strange intensity. Ramos was on lookout then, with eyes, radar, and rifle. But the spoken message had been too brief to get a fix on the direction of its radio waves. Ramos stiffened. With his phone power turned very low, he said, "Frank, lots of people say be cavalier nowadays, but that includes one of the old bunch. The voice might match, too." "Uh-huh. Tiflin, the SOB," Nelsen growled softly. For 10 hours nothing happened. Then there was some tiny radar blips which could have indicated meteors. Nelsen and Ramos changed the angle of the ion guides of their ionic motors to move their bubs from course slightly and dodge. During the first hour they were successful, but then there were more blips in greater numbers. Fist-sized chunks flicked through their vehicles almost simultaneously. Air puffed out. The rings collapsed under them. The sealer was no good for holes of such size. At once The continued spin of the bubbs wound them like limp laundry into knots. While Nelsen and Ramos were trying to untangle the mess, visible specks appeared in the distance. They fired at them. Then something slammed hard into the fleshy part of Nelsen's hip, penetrating his armor and passing on out again. The sealing gum in the Archer's skin worked effectively on the needle-like punctures, but the knockout drug had been delivered. As his awareness faded, Nelsen fired rapidly and saw Ramos doing the same, until his hand slapped suddenly at his side. After that, there was nothing, until for a few seconds Frank Nelsen regained a blurred consciousness. He was lying, unarmored, inside a bubb, perhaps his own, which had been patched and reinflated. All around him was loud laughter and talk, the gurgle of liquor, the smells of cooked meat, a choking concentration of tobacco smoke. Music blared furiously. "Bust out some more!" someone was hollering. "We got jackpot. The whole fancy works. I almost think I'm back in Sputsburg, wherever the hell that is. But where's the women? Nothing but dumb, prissy pictures. Not even good pictures." There were guys of all sizes, mostly young, some armored, some not. One with a pimply face stumbled near. Frank Nelsen choked down his fury at the vandalism. He had a blurred urge to find a certain face, and almost thought he succeeded. But everything, including his head, was a fuzzy jumble. "Hey," the pimply guy gurgled. "Hey, boss. Our benefactors, they're half awake. You should sleep, baby greenhorns." A large man with shovel teeth ambled over. Frank managed half to rise. He met the blow and gave some of it back. Ramos was doing likewise, gamely. Then Nelsen's head zeroed out again in a pyrotechnic burst. He awoke to almost absolute silence and the turning of the whole universe around him. But of course it was himself that was rotating, boots overhead. There was a bad smell of old sweat, and worse. His hip felt numb from the needle puncture. In all except the most vital areas, those slim missiles would not usually cause death, or even serious injury. But soon the wound would ache naggingly. Frank Nelsen hardly knew where he was. Then he understood he was drifting free in space, in an armor. He thought it was his own until he failed to recognize the scuffed, grimy interior. Even the work shirt he was wearing wasn't the new blue one he had put on, it seemed only hours ago. It was a greasy gray. Etched into the scratched plastic of the helmet that covered his head, he saw Archer 3, serial number 828211, and casually stuck into the gasketed rim of the collar was a note penciled jaggedly on a scrap of paper. "Honest, Greenie, you're a pal. All that nice stuff, thanks a million. Couple of my boys needed new Archies bad. Thanks again. You and your buddy are not having so bad a break. These old threes been all over hell. They will show you all about asteroid hopping and mining. So will the load hauling net and tools. Thanks for the little dough, too. Find your space fitness cards in the shirt pocket. We don't need it. Have lots of fun. Just remember me as the stinker." Frank Nelsen was quivering with anger and scare. He saw that a mended steel net containing a few items had got wrapped around him with his turning. He groped for the ion guide of the ancient shoulder ionic and touched the control. Slowly his spin was checked. Meanwhile he untangled himself and saw what must be Ramos, adrift like himself in a battered Archer 3, doing the same. Gradually they managed to ion glide over to each other. Their eyes met. They were the butts of a prank that no doubt had been the source of many guffaws. "Did you get a letter too, Frank?" Ramos asked. For close communication, the old helmet phones still worked okay. "I did," Nelsen breathed. "Why didn't they just knock us off? Alive, we might tell on them." "Not slow and funny enough, maybe," Ramos answered dolefully. "In these broken down outfits, we might not live to tell. Besides, even with these notes for clues, who'd ever find out who they are, way out here?" Nelsen figured that all this was probably the truth. In the Belt, life was cheap. Death got to be a joke. "There was an ox of a guy with big teeth," he hissed furiously. "Thought I saw Tiflin, too, the S.O.B. Cripes, do I always land in the soup?" "The boss man with the teeth I remember," Ramos grated. "Tiflin I don't know about. Could be. Hell, though, what now? I suppose we're going in about the same direction and at the same speed as before. Have to watch the sun and planets to make sure." "Did they leave us any instruments? Meanwhile, we might try to decelerate. I'd like to get out to Pluto sometime, but not equipped like this." "We'll check everything, see how bad off they left us," Nelsen said. So that was what they did, after they had set their decrepit shoulder ionics to slow them down in the direction of the belt. Each of their hauling nets contained battered chisels, hammers, saws for metal, a radiation counter, a beat-up looking pistol, some old position-finding instruments, including a wristwatch that had seen much better days to be used as a chronometer. There were also 2 large flasks of water and 2-month supply boxes of dehydrated space gruel. These last items obviously granted them from their own now vanished stores. Here was weird generosity, or perhaps just more ghoulish fun, to give them the feeble hope of survival. Now they checked each other's Archer 3s as well as they could while they were being worn. No use to even try to communicate over any distance with the worn-out radio transmitters. The nuclear batteries were 90% used up, which still left considerable time, fortunately, because they had to add battery power to the normally sun-energized shoulder ionics in order to get any reasonable decelerating effect out of them. Out here, unlike on the Moon at night, the air restorers could also take direct solar energy through their windows. They needed current only for their pumps. But the green chlorophane, key to the freshening and reoxygenation of air, was getting slightly pale. The moisture reclaimers were, by luck, not as bad as some of the other vital parts. Ramos touched his needled side. His wiry grin showed some of his reckless humor. "It's not utterly awful yet," he said. "How do you feel?" Nelsen's hip hurt, and he found that he had an awful hangover from the knockout drug and that slapping around he had received. "Bad enough," he answered. "Maybe if we ate something." They took small sealed packets of dehydrated food in through their chest airlocks, unsleeved their arms, emptied the packets into plastic squeeze bottles from the utensil racks before them, injected water from the pipettes which led to their shoulder tanks, closed the bottles, and let the powdered gruel swell as it reabsorbed moisture. The gruel turned out hot all by itself, for it was a new kind which contained an exothermic ingredient. They ate, in the absence of gravity, by squeezing the bottles. "Guess we'll have to become asteroid hoppers, miners, like the slob said," Nelsen growled. "Well, I did want to try everything." This was to become the pattern of their lives, but not right away. They still had an incomplete conception of the vast distances. They hurtled on, certainly decelerating considerably, for days, yet before they were in the belt, even that looked like enormous emptiness. And the bright speck of Pallas was too far to one side. Tovie Ceres was too near on the other side. Left it would be, if they considered the familiar northern hemisphere stars of Earth as showing up positions. The old instruments had put them off course. Still, they had to bear even farther left to match the direction and the average orbital speed, about 12 miles per second, of the belt. Otherwise, small pieces of the old planet, hurtling in another direction and or at a different velocity than themselves, could smash them. Maybe they thought that they would be located and picked up. The gang that had robbed and dumped them had found them easily enough. But there again was a paradox of enormity. Bands might wait for suckers somewhere beyond Mars. Elsewhere, there could be nobody for millions of miles. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Part 2 of The Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 5, Part 2. They saw their first asteroid, a pitted mesoderm fragment of nickel iron from middle deep in the blasted planet. It was just drifting slightly before them, so they had achieved the correct orbital speed. They ion glided to the chunk and began to search clumsily for worthwhile metal. It was fantastic that somebody had been there before them, chiseling and sawing out a grayish material, of which there was a little left that made the needles of their radiation counters swing wildly. They got a few scraps of the stuff to put in the nets which they were towing. "For luck," Ramos laughed. "Without it, we'll never pay, J. John." "Shut up. Big deal," Nelsen snapped. "Okay, shut up it is," Ramos answered. So they stayed silent until they couldn't stand that either. Everything was getting on their nerves. Their next asteroids were mere chips a foot long, core fragments of the planet, heavy metals that had sunk deep. No crust material of any normally formed world could ever show such wealth. It gleamed with a pale yellow shine and made Ramos's sunken eyes light up with an ancient fever until he remembered, and until Nelsen said, "Not for the gold anymore, pal. Common out here. So it's almost worthless everywhere. Not much use as an industrial metal. But the osmium and uranium alloyed with it are something else. One hunk for each of our nets. Too bad there isn't more." The uranium was driving the radiation counters wild. "Could we drag it if there was more?" Ramos growled. "With just sun power on these lousy shoulder ionics?" Everything was going sour, even Ramos. After a long deceleration, they were afraid to draw any more power for propulsion from their weakened batteries. They needed the remaining current for the moisture reclaimers and the pumps of the air restorers. A relatively much lighter but vital drain. The sunlight was weak way out here. Worse, the solar thermal couples to power the ionics were almost shot. They tried to fix them, succeeding a little, but using far more time than they had expected. Meanwhile, the changed positions of the various large asteroids, moving in their own individual orbits, lost them any definite idea of where the Kuzaks' supply post was, and the dizzying distance to Pallas, with only half-functioning ionics to get them there, fuddled them in their inexperience. Soon their big hope was that some reasonable asteroid hoppers would come within the few thousand-mile range of their weakened transmitters. Then they could call and be picked up. Mostly to keep themselves occupied, they hunted pay metal, taking only the very best that they could find, to keep the towage mass down. Right from the start, they cut their food ration, a good thing, because 1 month went, and then 2, as near as they could figure. Cripes, how much longer could they last? Often they actually encouraged their minds to create illusions. Frank would hold his body stiff and look at the stars. After a while, he would get the soothing impression that he was swimming on his back in a lake, and was looking up at the night sky. Mostly they were out of the regular radio channels, but sometimes, because of the movement of distant bub clusters that must be kept in touch, they heard music and news briefly again. They heard ominous reports from the ever more populous Earth. Now it was about areas of ocean to become boundaried and to be farmed for food. Territorial disputes were now extending far beyond the land. Once more the weapons were being uncovered. Of course there were repercussions out here. Ceres Station was beaming pronouncements too, rattling the saber. Nelsen and Ramos listened avidly, because it was life, because it was contact with lost things, because it was not dead silence. Their own tribulations deepened. "Cripes, but my feet stink," Ramos once laughed. "They must be rotten. They're sore, and they itch something awful, and I can't scratch them, or change my socks even. The fungus, I guess just old athlete's foot." "The stuff is crawling up my legs," Nelsen growled. They knew that the Kuzaks, maybe 2 and 2, Reynolds, GIMP, Story, must be trying to call them. They kept listening in their helmet phones. But this time Frank Nelsen knew that he'd gotten himself a real haystack of enormity in which to double for a lost needle. The slender beams could comb it futilely and endlessly in hope of a fortunate accident. Only once they heard, "Nelson, Rah!" The beam swept on. It could have been Joe Kuzak's voice, but inevitably, somewhere, there had to be a giving up point for the searchers. "This is where I came in," Nelson said bitterly. "Damn these beam systems that are so delicate and important." They did pick up the voices of scattered asteroid hoppers, talking cautiously back and forth to each other, far away. "Got me pinpointed, Ed. Coming in almost empty this trip. Not like the last. Stake me to a run into Palestine." Most of such voices sounded regular, friendly. Once they heard wild laughter and what could have been a woman's scream. But it could have been other things, too. On another occasion, they almost believed that they had their rescue made. Even their worn-out direction and distance finders could place the 10 or so voices as originating not much over 100 miles away. But they checked their trembling enthusiasm just in time. That was the sheerest luck. The curses and the savage, frightened snarls were all wrong. "If we don't catch us somebody soon..." Out here, the needs could get truly primitive. Oxygen, water, food, repair parts for vital equipment. Cannibalism and blood drinking could also be part of blunt necessity. Nelson and Ramos were fortunate. 20 miles off was a haze against the stars, a cluster of small mesoderm fragments. Drawing power for their shoulder ionics from their almost spent nuclear batteries, they glided toward the cluster and got into its midst, doubling themselves up to look as much like the other chunks as possible. They were like hiding rats for hours, until long after the distant specks moved past. While he waited, Frank Nelson's mind fumbled back to the lost phantom of Jarviston, Minnesota again. To a man named Jig Hollins, who had got married, stayed home. Yellow? Hell. Nelson imagined the comforts he might have had in the Space Force. He coaxed up a dream girl, blonde, dark, red-headed, with an awful wistfulness. He thought of Nance Codiss, the neighborhood kid. He fumbled at the edge of a vast, foggy vision, where the wanderlust and spacelust of a man and needs of the expanding race seemed to blend with his home love and love and to become, impossibly, a balanced unit. Later, much later, he heard young green asteroid hoppers yakking happily about girls and about how magnificent it was out here. "Ha ha," he heard Ramos mock. "Yeah," Nelson said thickly. "Lucky for them that they aren't near us, being careless with their beams that way." Frank Nelson sneered, despising these innocent novices, sure that he could have beaten and robbed them without compunction. That far he had come toward understanding the outlaws, the twisted men of the Belt. Ramos and he seemed to go on for an indefinite period longer. In a sense, they toughened. But toward the last they seemed to blunder slowly in the mind shadows of their weakening body forces. They had a little food left, and water from the moisture reclaimers. At zero gravity, where physical exertion is light, men can get along on small quantities of food. The sweetish, starchy liquid that they could suck through a tube from the air restorers. It was a byproduct of the photosynthetic process, might even have sustained them for a considerable interval. But the steady weakening of their nuclear batteries was another matter. The pumps of their air restorers and moisture reclaimers were dependent on current. Gradually, the atmosphere they breathed was getting worse. But from reports they had read and TV programs they had seen long ago, they found themselves another faint hope and worked on it. With only solar power, derived through worn-out thermocouple units, to feed their uncertain ionics, they could change course only very slowly now. Yet maybe they had used up their bad luck. At last they came to a surface fragment a couple of 100 yards long. They climbed over its edge. The thin sunshine hit dried soil and something like corn stubble in rows. Ahead was a stone structure, half flattened. Beside it, a fallen trunk showed its roots. Vegetation was charred black by the absolute dryness of space. There was a fragment of a road, a wall, a hillside. Here there must have been blue sky, thin frosty wind. The small Mars-sized planet had been far from the sun. Yet perhaps the greenhouse effect of a high percentage of carbon dioxide in its atmosphere and the radioactive heat of its interior had helped warm it. At least it had been warm enough to evolve life of the highest order, eons ago. Poof had gone the blue sky and this whole world, all in a moment, the scattered pieces forming the asteroids. Accident? More likely it was a huge interplanetary missile from competing Mars. The Martians had died too, as surely, though less spectacularly. Radioactive poison, perhaps. Here there had been an instant of unimaginable concussion, of a swift passing flame. The drying out was soon ended. Then what was left had been preserved in a vacuum through 60 millions of years. Frank Nelsen had glimpsed ancient Mars, preserved on the Moon. Now he glimpsed its opponent culture, about which more was generally known. "It's real," Ramos grunted. "Hoppers find surface fragments like this quite often." Nelsen hardly cared about the archaeological aspects just then. Excitement and hope that became certainty enlivened his dulled brain. "An energy source," he grated joyfully. "The big answer to everything, out here. And it's always self-contained in their buildings." They pushed the collapsed and blackened thing with the slender bones aside. They crept into the flat, horizontal spaces of the dwelling, much more like chinks than rooms that humans would inhabit. They shoved away soft, multicolored fabrics spun from glass wool, a metal case with graduated dials and a lens, baubles of gold and glinting minerals. In a recess in the masonry, ribboned with glazed copper strips that led to clear globes and curious household appliances, they found what they wanted. 6 little oblong boxes bunched together. Their outsides were blue ceramic. Frank Nelsen and Miguel Ramos began to work gingerly, though the gloves of their old Archer 3s were insulated. Here, 60 million years of stopped time had made no difference to these nuclear batteries, that, because of the universal character of physical laws, almost had to be similar in principle to their own. They had almost known that it would make no difference. There had been no drain of power through the automatic safety switches. "DC current, huh?" Ramos said, breathing hard of the rotten air in his helmet. "Yeah, gotta be," Frank answered quickly. "Same as from a thermocouple. Voltage about 200. Lots of current, though. Hope these old ionics'll take it." "We can tap off lower if we have to. Here, I'll fix you first. Grab this end." They had a sweating 2 hours of rewiring to get done. With power available, they might even have found a way to distill and collect the water usually held in the form of frost, deep buried in the soil of any large surface fragment. They might have broken down some of the water electronically to provide themselves with more oxygen to breathe. But perhaps now such efforts were not necessary. When they switched in the new current, the pumps of their equipment worked better at once. The internal lights of their air restorers could be used again, augmenting the action of the pale sunshine on the photosynthetic process of the chlorophane. The air they breathed improved immediately. They tested the power on the shaky ionics and got a good thrust reaction. "We can make it, I think," Frank Nelsen said, speaking low and quick, with the boldness of an enlivened body and brain. "We'll shoot up out of the belt entirely, then move parallel to it, backwards, contrary to its orbital flow, that is. But, being outside of it, we won't chance getting splattered by any fragments. Probably avoid some slobs, too. We'll decelerate and cut back in near Pallas." "There'll be a way to find the Kuzak twins." Ramos chuckled recklessly. "Let's not forget to pack these historical objects in our nets. Especially that camera, or whatever it is. Money in the bank at last, boy." But after they set out, it wasn't long before they knew that 2 people were following them. There was no place to hide, and a mocking voice came into their phones. "Hey, Nelsen, old Mex, wait up. I've been looking for you for over 3 months." They tried first to ignore the hail. They tried to speed up, but their pursuers still had better propulsion. Nelsen gritted his teeth. He felt the certainty of disaster closing in. "There's just 2 of them so far," Ramos hissed. Maybe here's our chance, Frank, to really smear that rat." Ramos's eyes had a battle light. "All right, Tiflin, approach. These guns are lined up and loaded." "Aw, is that friendship, Mex?" the renegade seemed to wheedle, but instantly he and his larger companion came on. "Toss us your pistols," Ramos commanded as they drifted close, checking speed. Tiflin flashed a smirk that showed that his front teeth were missing. "Honest, Mex, do you expect us to do that? Be cavalier. I haven't even got a pistol right now. Neither has Igor here. Come, look see. Hi, Frankie." "Just stay there," Nelsen gruffed. Tiflin cocked his head inside the helmet of a brand new Archer 6 in a burlesque pose for inspection. He looked bad. His face had turned hard and lean. There were scars on it. The nervous, explosive-tempered kid who couldn't have survived out here had been burned out of him. For a second, Nelsen almost thought that the change could be for the good. But it was naive to hope that that could happen. Glen Tiflin had become passive, yielding, mocking, with an air of secret knowledge withheld. What did an attitude like that suggest? Treachery, or perhaps worse, a kind of poised and poisonous mental judo. Nelsen looked at the other man, who wore a Tovey armor. Tall, starvation lean, horse-faced, with a lugubrious, bumpkinish smile that almost had a whimsical appeal. "Honest, I just picked up Igor, which ain't his real name, in the course of my travels," Tiflin offered lightly. "He used to be a comic back in Eurasia. He got bored with life on Ceres, and sort of tumbled away." With his body stiff as a stick, Igor toppled forward, his mouth gaping in dismay. He turned completely over, his great boots kicking awkwardly. His angular elbows flapped like crow wings. He righted himself, looked astonished, then beautifully self-approving. He burped delicately, patted his chest plate, then sniffed in sad protest at the leveled pistols. Now Nelsen and Ramos cast off the loaded nets they had been towing and closed in on this strange pair. Nelsen did the searching while Ramos pointed the guns. "Haven't even got my shiv anymore, Frankie," Tiflin remarked casually. "Threw it at a guy named Fesler once, missed by an inch. Guess it's still going, round and round the sun for millions of years. Longest knife throw there ever was." "Fesler?" Frank snapped. "Now we're getting places, you SOB. That funny character that robbed and dumped Ramos and me, I'll bet. Probably with your help. You know him, huh?" "Knew for a while, past tense," Tiflin chuckled wickedly. "Nope, it wasn't me that stripped off his armor in space. He wasn't even around anymore when you beauties got caught. They come and they go." "But you were around, Tiflin." "Maybe not. Maybe I was 20 million miles off." Like hell, Nelsen gritted his teeth, grabbed Tiflin's shoulder, and swung his gloved fist as hard as he could against the thin layer of rubber and wire over Tiflin's stomach. He struck 3 times. "Damn you," Nelsen snarled. "I promised myself I'd get you good, Tiflin. Now tell us what else you and your friends are cooking for us. Or, by the big silence, you'll be a drifting, explosively decompressed mummy." Frank Nelsen didn't know till now, after exerting himself, how weak privations had made him. He felt dizzy. Tiflin's eyes had glazed slightly as he and Frank did a slow roll together. He gasped, but that insulting smirk came back. "Haven't had your Wheaties lately, have you, Frank? Go ahead, hit, knock yourself out. You too, Mex. I've been slugged before, by big men, in shape. Could be I'm not cooking anything. Except I notice that you two have found yourselves some very interesting local objects of ancient history, worth a little money. Also some good raw metal. Well, I suppose you want to get the load and yourselves to the famous twins, Art and Joe. That's easy, with luck. Though the region is a trifle disturbed right now, but I can tell you where they are. You won't have to fiddle around hunting." "Here, hold these guns, Frank. Let me have a couple pokes at that slob," Ramos snapped. All right. Who's asking you guys to believe me?" Tiflin cut in. "I'll beam the twins for you. Since I guess your transmitters won't reach, you can listen in and talk back through my set, okay?" "Let's see what happens, just for kicks," Ramos said softly. "If you're calling some friends to come and get us or anything, Tif, well, you've had it." They watched Tiflin spin and focus the antenna. "Kuzak, Kuzak, Kuzak, Kuzak," he said into his phone. "Missing boys alive and coming to you. Mex and old guess which. Kicking and independent, but very hungry, I think. Put on the coffee pot, you storekeepers. Kuzak, Kuzak, Kuzak. Talk up, Frank and Miguel. Your voices will relay through my phone." "Hi, Art and Joe, it's us," Ramos almost apologized. "Yeah, we don't quite know yet what Tiflin is pulling, but here we are, if it's you we're talking to." There was the usual long wait as impulses bridged the light minutes. Then Art Kuzak's voice snarled guardedly. "I hear you, Ram and Nell. Come in, if you can. Tif, you garbage, someday..." This is all. The message broke off. Tiflin smirked. "Third quadrant of the belt," he said, giving a position in space almost like latitude and longitude on Earth. "About 20 minutes of the 31st degree. 3 degrees above medium orbital plane, approximately 200 hours from here. Can Igor and I leave you now, or do you want us to escort you in?" "We'll escort you," Ramos said. So it was until near the end of a long ride a cluster of bubbs was in view in the near distance, and Ramos and Nelsen could contact Art Kuzak themselves. "We've got Tiflin and his Tovi pal with us, Art," Frank Nelsen said. "They showed us the way, more or less because we made them. But Tif did give us the right position at the start. A favor, maybe, I don't know. And now he's saying, 'Be cavalier, it might be awkward for me to meet Art and Joe just at the present.' Do you want to fix this character's wagon bad enough? Your customers could get mean, if he ever did them dirt." "Just one thing I've got against Tiflin," Art snarled back. "Every time I hear his voice it means trouble. But I've never seen the crumb face to face since the moon hop. Okay, let's not spoil my stomach. Turn him loose. It can't make much difference. Or maybe I'm sentimental about the old bunch. He was our cracked, space-wild punk." "Thanks, Art," Tiflin laughed. In a minute, he and his comic scarecrow pal, who originated from the dark side of trouble, on Earth and out here too, were fading against the stars. Nelsen and Ramos, the long lost, glided in past some grim hoppers. A bub and sweet air were around them once more. They shed their stinking Archer 3s. Hot showers, miraculous luxury, played over them. They rubbed disinfected salves into their fungus-ridden hides. Then there was a clean white table with plates, knives, forks. They had to treat their shrunken stomachs gently. Just a little of everything: beer, steak, vegetables, fruit. Somewhere during the past, unmarked days, Frank Nelsen had gotten to be 20 years old. Only 20. Well, maybe this was his celebration. Ramos and he told their story very briefly. Little time was wasted on congratulations for survival, or talk of losses long past. The Kuzaks looked leaner and tougher now, and there were plenty of present difficulties to worry them. Joe Kuzak hurried out to argue with the miners at the raw metal receiving bends, and at the store bubs. Art stayed to explain the present situation. 3 big loads of supplies were shipped through to us from the moon, he growled. We did fine, trading for metal. We sent J. John Reynolds his percentage, a fair fraction of his entire loan. We sent old Paul $5,000. But the 4th and 5th loads of trade stuff got pirated en route. When there's trouble on Earth, it comes out here, too. Ceres, colonized by our socialist Tovi friends of northern Eurasia, helps stir up the bums, who think up plenty of hell on their own. It's a force-out attempt aimed at us or at anybody who thinks our way. After 2 lost shipments and a lot of new installations here at the post, we're about broke again. Worse, we've got the asteroid hoppers expecting us to come through with pay for the new metal in their nets, and with stuff they need. Back home, some people used to raise hell about a trifle like a delayed letter. How about a spaceman's reaction when what is delayed may be something to keep him alive? They could really get annoyed and kick this place apart. Art Kuzak blew air up past his pug nose and continued. Finance? Here we go again, Frank, he chuckled. Gimp Hines is helping us. After Mars, he came here without trouble. He's in Palestine now, trying to raise some fast cash and to rush supplies through from there, under Space Force guard. You know he's got a head for commerce as well as science. But our post here perhaps isn't considered secure enough to back a loan anymore. Art grinned wryly at Nelson and Ramos. His hint was plain. He had seen the museum pieces that they had brought in. Should we, Frank? Ramos chuckled after a moment. Possibly. We've got some collateral, Art. Lots more valuable per unit mass than any raw metal, I should think. So you might want to work for us, Art inquired blandly. Not for, Nelson chuckled. We might say with. Okay, cuties, Art laughed. Joe Cusack had just come back into the dwelling, an office bub. Don't let my twin sell you any rotten apples, fellas, he warned lightly. He might be expecting you to transport your collateral to Palestine. Naturally, anybody trying to strangle this post will be blocking the route. You might get robbed again. Also murdered. Ramos's gaunt face still had its daring grin. Frank and I know that, he said. I'm past bragging, but we've had experience. Now we might be smart enough to get through. A few more days out there won't hurt. How about it, Frank? 10 hours sleep and breakfast, Frank said. Then a little camouflage material, new weapons, a pair of archers in condition. Got any left? 5 in stock, Joe answered. Settled, then? Art asked. Here it is, Ramos answered, and Nelson nodded. It would have been rough going for them to try to sleep in beds. They had lost the habit. They slept inside their new Archer 5s. Afterwards, they painted their armor a dark gray, like chunks of mesoderm stone. They did likewise to the 2 bundles in which they wrapped their relics. They were as careful as possible to get away from the post without being observed, visually or by radar. But of course, you could never be sure. Huddled up to resemble stray fragments, they curved out of the belt, toward the pole star, north of its orbital plane. Moving in a parallel course, they proceeded towards Palestine. The only thing that would seem odd was that they were moving contrary to the general orbital rotation of most of the permanent bodies of the solar system. Of course, they and their bundles might have been stray meteors from deep in space. 4 watchful, armored figures seemed to notice the peculiarity of their direction and to become suspicious. These figures seemed too wary for honesty as they approached. They got within 25 miles. Even without the memory that Tiflin might make guesses about what they meant to do, Nelson and Ramos would have taken no chances. They had to be brutal. Homing darts pierced armor. The 4 went to sleep. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. Part 1 of The Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 6, Part 1. The asteroid Pallas was a chunk of rich core material, 200-some miles in its greatest dimension. It had a mottled pinkish shine, partly from untarnished lead, osmium, considerable uranium, some iron, nickel, silver, copper. The metals were alloyed here, almost pure there. There was even a little rock, but 35% of Pallas's roughly spherical mass was said to be gold. Gold is not rare at the cores of the worlds, to which most of the heavy elements must inevitably sink during the molten stage of planetary developments. On Earth it must be the same, though who could dig through 3,000 miles into a zone of such heat and pressure? But the asteroid world had exploded. Pallas was an exposed and cooled piece of its heart. Pallas had a day of 24 hours because men, working with great ion jets angling towards the stars, had adjusted its natural rate of rotation for their own convenience to match the terrestrial. A greater change was Palestine. Frank Nelson and Miguel Ramos made the considerable journey to it without further incident. Because he was tense with hurry, Nelson's impressions were superficial. Something like Serene, but bigger and more fantastic. A man weighed only a few ounces here. Spidery guidance towers could loom impossibly high. There were great storage bins for raw metals brought in from all over the belt. There were rows of water tanks. As on the Moon, the water came mostly from gypsum rock or occasionally from soil frost, both found on nearby crustal asteroids. Beyond the refineries bulged the domes of the city itself, housing factories, gardens, recreation centers, and sections that got considerably lost and divergent trying to imitate the apartment house areas of Earth. Frank Nelson's wonder was hurried and dulled. Gimp Hines and David Lester were waiting inside the stellene reception dome when Nelson and Ramos landed lightly at the port on their own feet, with no more braking assistance than their own shoulder ionics. Greetings were curiously breathless, yet casual, but without any backslapping. "We'd about given you two up," Gimp said. "But an hour ago, Joe Cusack beamed me and said you'd be along with some museum stuff. Les lives here now, working with the new Archaeological Institute." "Hi, good to see you guys," Ramos said. "Likewise. Hello, Les," Frank put in. While Frank was gripping David Lester's limp, diffident hand, which seemed almost to apologize for his having come so far from home, Gimp teased a little. "So you latched on to Art Kuzak too, or was it the other way around?" Frank's smile was lopsided. "I didn't analyze motives. Art's a pretty good guy. I suppose we just wanted to help Joe and him out. Or maybe it was instinct. Anyhow, what's wrong with latching onto, or being latched onto, by somebody who you feel will get himself and you ahead, and make you both a buck?" "Check. Not a darn thing," Gimp laughed. "Now let's go to my hotel and have a look at what you brought in. Did you really examine it yet?" "Some on the way. Not very much," Ramos said. "There's a camera." In the privacy of Gimp's quarters, the bundles were opened. The contents, some of them dried and gruesome, all of them rather wonderful, were exposed. David Lester and Gimp Hines were both quietly avid. Lester knew the most about these things, but Gimp's hands, on the strange camera, were more skillful. The cautious scrutiny of dials and controls, marked with cryptic numerals and symbols, and the probing of detailed parts and their functions, took about an hour. "What do you think, Les?" Gimp asked. "I'm not an expert yet," Lester answered, "but as far as I know, this is the first undamaged camera that has yet been found. That makes it unique. Of course, by now, hoppers are bringing in quite a lot of artifacts from surface asteroids. But there's not much in the way of new principle for our camera manufacturers to buy. Lens systems, shutters, shock mountings, self-developing, integral viewing, projecting, and sonic features all turn out to be similar to ours. It's usually that way with other devices, too. It's as if all their history and ours were parallel." "Well, damn it, let's see what the thing can show," Ramos gruffed. In the darkened room, the device threw a rectangle of light on the wall. Then there was shape, motion, and color, kept crystallized from 60 million years before. A cloud, pinked by sunrise, floating high in a thin, expanded atmosphere. Did clouds everywhere in the universe always look much the same? Wolfish, glinting darts, vanishing away. Then a mountainside covered with spiny growths that, from a distance, seemed half cactus and half pine. A road, a field, a dull-hued cylinder pointing upwards. Shapes of soft, bluish gray, topped like rounded roofs, unfolding out of a chink, and swaying off in a kind of run, with little clinkings of equipment, for there were sounds, too. Two eye-like organs projecting upward, the pupils clear and watchful. A tendril with a ridged, dark hide waving what might have been a large blue flower, which was attached to the end of a metal tube by means of a bit of fiber tied in a granny knot. A sunburst of white fire in the distance. It could have gone on perhaps for many hours. Reality with every detail sharp. Parallels with earthly life. Maybe even sentiment was there, if you only knew how it was shown. But in the differences you got lost, as if in a vivid dream that you couldn't fully understand. Though what was pictured here was certainly from the last beautiful days of a competing planet. Frank Nelsen's mouth often hung open with fascination, but his own realities kept intruding. They prodded him. "I hate to break this off," he said, "but a lot of asteroid hoppers are out at the post, waiting for Ramos and me to bring stuff back. It's a long ride through a troubled region. There's plenty to get arranged beforehand. So first, what do we do to realize some quick funds out of these relics?" Hines terminated the pictured sequence. "Frank, Ramos, I'll keep this camera," he said urgently. "It's a little bit special, at least. History is here to be investigated. Offers, bids could come up. Okay, I'm talking about dough again. Still, who wants to detach himself right away from something pretty marvelous by selling it? I'll dump most of the other things. Getting a loan? The hockshop approach is no good. Am I telling it right, Les?" Lester nodded. "More of the same will be brought in. Prices will drop. Archaeological Survey has a buying service for museums back home. I've been working for them for a month. I don't claim to love them entirely, but they'll give you the safest break. You should get enough for your purposes without the camera. With a load like this, you can see Doc Linford, the boss, at any time." "Right now, then," Frank said. "Hey, you impolite slobs," Ramos laughed. "When do you consult me, co-discoverer and owner? All right, skip it. You're the Wizard of Oz. I'll just grab a few items for my ma and the kids, and maybe a girl or two I'll meet someplace. You guys might as well do the same." He took some squares of fabric, silken soft, though spun from fibers of colored glass, and some wheeled devices, which might have been toys. Lester and Hines picked up only token pieces of the fabric. Frank took a 3-inch golden ring that glinted with mineral. Except that it looked decorative, he had no idea of its original purpose. The broken, fine-boned mummy and the other items were appraised and bought in a large room across the city. It was already cluttered with queer fossils and objects. The numbers printed on the 2 equal checks and on the cash in their hands still looked slightly mythical to Nelsen and Ramos, to whom $1,000 had seemed a fortune. Later, at the USSF headquarters, he was prepared to argue grimly. Words were in his mind. A vital matter of supply. Without an escort, we still have to try to get through alone. You have been informed, therefore. If anything happens, you will be responsible. He didn't have to say anything like this. They knew. Maybe an old bitterness had made him misjudge the USSF. A young colonel smiled tiredly. "This has been happening," he said. "We have limited facilities for this purpose. The UNSF even less. However, an escort is due in now. We can move out again with you in 7 hours." "Thank you, sir," Nelsen responded. Gimp Hines had the better part of the supplies to be purchased already lined up at the warehouses. Nelsen counted the money he had left. "Figuring losses and gains, I have no idea how much I owe J. John, if anything," he laughed. "So I'll make it $1,000, build up my ego. But we owe old Paul more than dough." "All right, I'm another idiot. I'll mail J. John a similar draft," Ramos gruffed. "Paul's a problem. He can use money, but he never lived for it. And you can't buy a friend. We'll have to rig something." "Yeah, we will," Gimp said. "Couple of times I forgot J. John, but I lost my shirt on those loads that were lifted off you boneheads. The Kuzaks reimbursed me for half. Do you two want to cover the other half? Aw, forget it. Who's got time to figure all this? That old coot doped himself out a nice cash dollar scheme, making us promise. Or Was it a leg pull on a highly elusive proposition, where big sums and the vastness of space seemed to match? Hell, I'm getting mixed up again. David Lester had wandered off embarrassedly there in the warehouse, but now he returned, clearing his throat for attention. "Fellas," he said, "Helen and I want you to come out to our apartment now for dinner." "Shucks, that's swell, Les," Ramos responded, suddenly curious. "Here also," Nelsen enthused. "Sure," Gimp said, but his smile thinned. In this gravity, going to Lester's place was a floating glide rather than a walk, along a covered causeway, into a huge dome, up a wall with handholds, onto a wispy balcony. Nelsen and Ramos brought liquor and roses. Much of what followed was painful and familiar, in a fantastic setting. Two young people, recently married, struggling with problems that they hadn't been able to plan for very well. While his wife was out of earshot, Lester put his hand on the back of a chair constructed entirely of fine, golden wire. Later it developed that he had made it, do-it-yourself fashion, to be economical, and seemed more intent on holding it down than to rest his hand. "Gimp, Frank," he began nervously, "you helped Helen and me get married and get set up out here. The Archaeological Institute paid our way to Palestine, but there were other expenses. My father-in-law, died by his own hand while still awaiting trial. Everything he owned is still tied up. Now, well, you know human biology. I hope you can wait a little longer for us to begin paying back your loan." Nelsen had a vagrant thought about how money now had to stand on its own commercial value, rather than rely on the ancient witchcraft of a gold standard. Then he almost suspected that Lester was being devious and clever, but he knew the guy too well. "Cripes, Les," he burst out almost angrily. "How about your services, just now, as an archaeological consultant? If you won't consider that we might have meant to make you a gift, pretty soon you'll have us completely confused." "What a topic for an evening of fun," Gimp complained. "Hey, Helen, can I mix the drinks?" "Yes, of course, Mr. Hines. I'll get you the things," she said, with an apology in her eye and voice, as if fussy celebrities had descended on her small, unsettled, and poor household. "On the Moon you were a swell cook, Helen," Frank reminded her. She flashed a small smile. "It was different there. Things weighed something and stayed in place. Here, just breathe hard and you have a kitchen accident. Besides, I had a garden. We'd like one here, but there's no room. And in the market..." "Shucks, it's new here to us, too," Ramos soothed. "Riding an Archer in space at 0G is different from this." Things were a bit less strained after that, through the skimpy meal, with its special devices unique to the asteroid and their tiny gravity. Clamps to fasten plates to tables and victuals to plates. Drinking vessels that were half squeeze bottles. Such equipment was now available in what might have once been called a dime store, but with another price level. The visitors made a game of being awkward and inept together. It was balm for Helen's sensitivity. "Somebody's got to keep the camera for us, Mex," Frank Nelsen said presently. "Yeah, I know. Les'll do it for us," Ramos answered. "He's the best, there. He can run through all the pictures, make copies with an ordinary camera. See if he can market them. 20% ought to be about right for his cut." Lester tried to interrupt, but Frank got ahead of him. "We owe Gimp for those loads we lost. Got to cut him into this as a consultant. You'll be around Palestine for a while, helping out with this end of the twins' enterprise, won't you, Gimp?" Hines grinned. "Probably. Glad you slobs got memories. Glad to be of assistance any time. Les is no louse. He'll help old friends. I'll bring him the camera out of the safe at my hotel as soon as we leave here." Lester smiled doubtfully, then happily. This was how they worked the fabulous generosity of spacemen in the chips on him. Nelsen, Ramos, and Hines escaped soon after that. 3 hours left. I guess you guys want to get lost, separately, Gimp chuckled. I'll say so long at the launching catapults. Later, I've got some tough guards fresh from the moon who will go along with you. Art and Joe need them." Frank Nelsen wandered alone in the recreation area. He heard music. Fire Streak, Queen of Serene. He searched faces, looking for an ugly one with shovel teeth. He thought, with achy wistfulness, of a small hero-worshipping girl named Jenny Harper at Serene. He found no one he had ever seen before. In a joint he watched a girl with almost no clothes do an incredible number of spinning somersaults in midair. He thought he ought to find himself a friend, then decided perversely to hell with it. He thought of the trouble on Earth, on Ceres, of Tiflin and Igor, of Fanshawe, the latest leader of the asteroid belt toughs, the Jolly Lads, that you heard about. He thought about how terribly vulnerable to attack Paleston seemed, even with its encirclement of outriding guard stations. He thought of Paul Hendricks, 2 and 2 Baines, Charlie Reynolds, Otto Kramer, Mitch Story, and Miss Rosalie Parks, who was his old Latin teacher. He thought of trying to beam some of them, but hell, they all seemed so long lost, and he wasn't in the mood now. He even thought about how it was trying to give yourself a dry shave with a worn-out razor inside an Archer. He thought that sometime, surely, perhaps soon, the big vacuum would finish him. He wound up with a simple, sentimental impulse, full of nostalgia and tenderness for things that seemed to stay steady and put. The way he felt was half-hearted apology for human moods in which murder would have been easy. He even had a strange envy for David Lester. Into the synthetic cellulose lining of a small carton bought at a souvenir shop, he placed the 60-million-year-old golden band, with its odd arabesques and its glinting chips of mineral. Regardless of its mysterious, intentional function, it could be a bracelet. To him, just then, it was only a trinket that he had picked up. Before he wrapped and addressed the package, he put a note inside. "Hi, Nance Codiss. Thinking about you and all the neighbors. This might reach you by Christmas. Remember me? Frank Nelsen." Postage was $200, which seemed a trifle, and he didn't quite realize how like a king's ransom a gift like this would seem in Jarviston, Minnesota. On leaving the post office, he promptly forgot the whole matter, as hard, practical concerns took hold of him again. At the loading quays, special catapults hurled the gigantic bales of supplies clear of Pallas. To the Kuzaks, this shipment would now have seemed small, but it was much larger than the loads Ramos and Nelsen had handled before. GIMP and Lester saw them off. Then they were in space, with extra ionics pushing the bales. The guard of 6 new men was posted. Nelsen wasn't sure they'd be any good, or whether he could trust them all, but they looked eagerly alert. Riding a mile off was the Space Force patrol bub. All through the long journey, beam calls ahead were avoided for added safety. Nelsen kept wondering if he'd find the post in ruins, with what was left of Art and Joe drifting and drying. But nothing like that happened yet, and the shipment was brought through. Business with the asteroid hoppers was started at once. When there was a lull, Art Kuzak talked expansively in his office bub. "Good work, Frank. Same to you, Ramos. Except that I know you're itching with your own ideas and probably won't be around long. Which is your affair. Never mind what anybody says about Venus or any other place. The belt, with its history, its metals, and its possibilities, is the best part of the solar system. Keep your defenses up, your line of communication covered, and you can't help but make money. There are new posts to set up, help to recruit and bring out, stellene plants and other factories to construct. There'll be garden bubs, repair shops, everything. Time, work, and a little luck will do it. You listening, Frank?" Nelsen got a bit cagey with Art again. "Okay, Art. You seem like a formal fella. Mex and I joined up and helped out pretty much as informal company members. But as long as we've put in our dough, let's make it official, in writing, and signed. The KRNH Enterprises. Kuzak, Ramos, Nelsen, and Hines. The H could also stand for Hendricks, Paul Hendricks." "I like it that way, you suspicious slob," Art Kuzak chuckled. So another phase began for Nelsen. Offices bored him. Amassing money, per se, meant little to him, except as a success symbol that came out of the life he had known. He figured that a man ought to be a success, even a rough-and-tumble romantic like Ramos or Joe Kuzak, or himself, with both distance and home ingrained confusingly into his nature. One thing that Nelsen was conscientious. He could choose and stick to a purpose for even longer than it seemed right for him. Mostly now, during the long grind of expansion, he was afield. Disturbances on Earth quieted for a while, as had always happened so far. The Belt responded with relative peace. Tovi Circes, the big asteroid, which like the others should have been open to all nations but wasn't, kept mostly to its own affairs. There were only the constant dangers, natural, human, and a combination. There was always a job, a convoy to meet, a load of supplies to rush to a distant point, jolly lads to scare off. Reckless Ramos might be with Nelsen or Joe Kuzak, who usually operated separately, or a few guards or several asteroid hoppers, most of whom were tough and steady and good friends to know. Often enough, Nelsen was alone. At first, KRNH just handled the usual supplies. But when factory and hydroponic equipment began to arrive, Joe Kuzak and Frank Nelsen might be out establishing a new post. There'd be green help bubbing out from the moon to break in. Nelsen would see new faces that still seemed familiar because they were like those of the old bunch, as it had been. Grim, scared young men full of wonder. But the thin stream of the adventurous was thickening as more opportunities opened. Occasionally there was a young couple. Oh, no, you thought. Then, well, maybe. That is, if somebody didn't crack up or get lymph node swellings that wouldn't reduce, and if you didn't have to try to play nursemaid. Now and then Nelsen was in Palestine for business, for relief, for a bit of hell-raising, to see GIMP and the David Lesters. Pretty soon there was an heir in the Lester household. Red, healthy, and male. Cripes, out here, too. Okay, josh the parents along. The most wonderful boy in the solar system. Otherwise, matters there were much better than before. The camera was in a museum in Washington. The pictures it had contained were on TV back home. Just another anti-war film, maybe. But impressive and different. The earnings didn't change Nelsen's life much, nor Gimp's, nor Ramos's. But it sure helped the Lesters. End of Chapter 6, Part 1. Two of the Planet Strappers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Planet Strappers by Raymond Z. Gallun. Chapter 6, Part 2. David Lester had resigned from Archaeological Survey. He was getting actually sharp. He was doing independent research and was setting up his own business in Belt Antiques. Frank Nelsen had another reason for coming to Palestine. Afield, you avoided beam communication nowadays whenever you could. Someone might trace your beam to its source and jump you for whatever you had. But Gimp Hines could tell Nelsen about the absent Bunch members and the old friends, while they both sat in the little KRNH office in town. Paul Hendricks is still the same, Frank. New bunch around him. Too bad we can't call him now, because the Earth is on the far side of the sun. Mitch Story just vanished into the Martian thickets during one of his jaunts, almost a year ago now. I didn't see him when I stopped over on Mars, but he was back at the station once after that. Take it easy, Frank. They've looked with helicopters, and even on the ground. You couldn't do any more. I'll keep in touch to see if anything turns up. After a minute, Nelsen relaxed slightly. 2 and 2? I guess he's okay, with Charlie Reynolds looking after him. Peculiar about Charlie, Gimp answered, looking awed and puzzled. Got the news from old J. John, his granddad, when he acknowledged the receipt of our latest draft by letter. Hold your hat. Charlie got himself killed. I'll dig the letter out of the file." Nelson sat up very straight. "Never mind," he said. "Just tell me more. Anything can happen." "Our most promising member," GIMP mused. "He didn't get much. The Venus expedition had to move some heavy equipment to the top of a mountain to make some electrostatic tests before a storm. Charlie had just climbed down from the helicopter. A common old lightning bolt hit him. Somebody played Fire Streak on the bagpipes inside a sealed tent while they buried him. Otherwise, he didn't even get a proper spaceman's funeral. Venus's escape velocity is almost as high as Earth's. Boosting a corpse up into orbit just for atmospheric cremation would have been too much of a waste for the expedition's rigid economy." Nelson had never really been very close to Charlie Reynolds, though he had liked the flamboyant good guy. Now it was all a long ways back. Besides, Nelson didn't feel exactly grief, just an almost mystical bitterness, a shock, and an uncertainty, as if he could depend on nothing. "So what about Two and Two?" he growled, remembering how he used to avoid any responsibility for the big, good-hearted lug. But now he felt surer about himself, and things seemed different. "I guess the expedition medic had to straighten him out with devil killers," Hines answered. "He bubbed all the way back to Earth, alone, to see J. John about Charlie. I beamed him there, before the Earth hid behind the sun. He was still pretty shaken up. Funny, too. Charlie's opportunity-laden Venus has turned out to be a bust, for 2 centuries at least, unless new methods, which aren't in sight yet, turn up. Sure, at staggering expense, and with efforts on the order of fantasy. Reaction motors could be set up around its equator to make it spin as fast as the Earth. Specially developed green algae have already been seeded all over the planet. They're rugged, they spread fast. But it will take the algae about 200 years to split the carbon dioxide and give the atmosphere a breathable amount of free oxygen, to say nothing of cracking the poisonous formaldehyde." "Two and Two's back in Jarviston, then?" Nelson demanded. "No, not anymore. Just give me breath," Hines went on. He and Charlie had figured another destination of opportunity. Mercury, the planet nearest the sun. Everlasting frozen night on one side, eternal zinc-melting sunshine on the other. But there's the fringe zone between the two, the twilight zone. If you can live under stellene, you've got a better place there than Mars might have been. Colonists are going there, to quit the Earth, to get away from it all. Two and Two was about to leave for Mercury when I last spoke to him. By now, he's probably almost there. And even under the most favorable conditions, Mercury is hard to beam. Too much solar magnetic interference." "The poor sap," Nelson gruffed. "It probably isn't that bad anymore," Hines commented. "Sometime I might go to Mercury myself, when I get good and sick of sitting on my tail here, when I always was a man of action. Mercury does have possibilities. Plenty of solar power, certainly. Plenty of frozen atmosphere on the dark side. Interesting, Frank. Oh, hell, I forgot. There's a letter here for you, and a package. Just arrived. I'll scram now. Got to go down to the quays. Hold the fort here, will you?" Gimp Hines grinned as he left. Nelson was glad to be alone. The lonesomeness of the big vacuum was getting grimed into him. When he saw the return name and address on the package, and the $210 postage sticker, he thought, "Cripes, that poor kid. What did I start?" Then the awful wave of nostalgia for Jarviston, Minnesota hit him as he fumbled to open the microfilmed letter capsule and put it in the viewer. "Hello, Frank. It has to be that, doesn't it, and not Mr. Nelson, since you've sent me this miraculous bracelet, which I don't dare wear very much, since I don't want to lose an arm to some international, or even interstellar, jewel thief. It makes me feel like the queen of something, certainly not serene, since it implies calmness and repose, which I certainly don't feel. No offense to our Miss Sands, whom I admire enormously. In a very small way I am repaying you in kind, an item which I made myself, and which I know that some spacemen use inside their Archers. You see, we are all informed in details. Paul, Otto, Chippy Potter and his dog, and other characters whom you won't remember, send their best greetings. Oh, I've got Stardust fever too, but I'll yield to my folks' wishes and wait and learn a profession that will be of some use out there. May you wear what I'm sending in good health, safety, and fortune. Send no more staggering gifts, please. I couldn't stand it, but please do write. Tell me how it really is in the Belt. You simply don't realize how much... Nance Codice's missive rattled along, and the scrawled words got to be like small happy bells inside Nelson's skull. His crooked grin came out. He unpacked the sweater. Crayon wool, very warm, bright red. A bit crude in workmanship here and there, but imagine a girl bothering these days. He donned the garment and decided it fit fine. Then he tried to write a letter. Hi, Nance. I just put it on first time. Beautiful. It'll stay right with me. Thanks. Talk about being staggered. There he bogged down some, wondering how much she had changed, wondering just what he ought to say to her, and who these characters that he wouldn't remember might be. Cripes, how old was she now? 17? He ended up taking her at her word. He described Palestine rather heavy-handedly, and bought some microfilm postcards to go along with his missive as soon as he went out to mail it. But a few hours later, from deep in space, he looked back at the town, shining in the distance, and in the blue mood of thinking about Charlie Reynolds, Mitch Story, and Two and Two, he wondered how much longer it, or Nance, or anything else could last. Then he glanced down at the bright sweater and chuckled. Unexpectedly, Ramos remained an active member of KRNH Enterprises for over a year. But the end had to come. I told Art I'd let my dough ride, Frank, he said to Nelson in the lounge of Post 1. I'll only draw enough earnings to build me a real deep space bub, nuclear propelled, and with certain extra gadgets. A few guys have tried to follow the unmanned, instrumented rockets out to the system of Saturn. Nobody got back yet. I think I know what they figured wrong. The instruments showed... Well, skip it. I'm going into town to prepare. It'll take quite a while, so I'll have some fun, too. Ramos's eyes twinkled with a secret triumph before the fact. You don't argue a fighting rooster out of fighting, Nelson laughed. Besides, it wouldn't be destiny or any fun to succeed. So accept the complimentary comparison if it fits, which maybe it doesn't, you egotistical bonehead. Good luck. Buena suerte, amigo. I'll look you up in town if I get a chance. Nelson was always busy to the gills. Progress was so smooth for another couple of years that the hunch of big trouble building up became a gnawing certainty in his nerves. Of course, there were always the jolly lads to watch out for, the extreme individualists, space-twisted and wild. Robbing and murdering could seem easier than digging. Take your loot into Palestine. Who knew you hadn't grubbed it yourself? Sell it. Get the stink blown off you. Forget some terrible things that happened to you. Have yourself a time. Strike out again. Repeat. Nelson knew that. Through the months, he had killed defensively at least twice. Once with a long-range homing bullet. Weapons sanctioned by pious and cautious international agreement were more lethal now to match the weapons of the predatory. Once by splitting a helmet with a rifle barrel. When he was out alone, exploring a new post site on a small asteroid, a starved Tovi runaway had jumped him. Maybe he should regret the end of that incident. Trips to Palestine were increasingly infrequent, but there was one time when he almost had come especially to see Ramos's new bub, still under wraps, supposedly. Well, that erratic character had it out on a long test run, damn him. As usual, time was crowding Nelson. He had to get back on the job. He had just a couple of hours left. He wrote a letter to Nance Codice, answering one of hers. Funny, he'd never yet tried to contact her vocally. Being busy, being cautious about using a beam, these were good reasons. Now, there was hardly enough spare time to reach twice across the light minutes. Maybe the real truth was that men got strangely shy in the silences of the Belt. Dear Nance, you seem to be making fine headway in your new courses. All the good words for that. There were plenty of good words, but he didn't put many of them down. He didn't know if the impulse to write darling was just his own loneliness, which any girl with a kind word would have filled. He didn't know her or that part of himself very well. He kept remembering her as she had been. Then he realized that memory wasn't a stable thing to hang on to. Everything changed. How well he had learned that. She was older now, intelligent, and at school again, studying some kind of medical laboratory technology. Certainly she had become more sophisticated and elusive. Her gay letters were just a superficial part of what she must be. And certainly there were dates and boyfriends and all the usual phases of getting out of step with a mere recollection like himself. Nelsen had some achy emotions. Should he ask for her picture? Should he send one of himself? He just scribbled on, rambling as usual. Yet in a new Archer 7 you could undo a few clamps, pull a foot out of a boot, and actually change your socks. Inconsequential nonsense like that. He ended by telling her not to worry about any knickknacks he might send, that they came easy out here. He micro-posted the letter, and mailed a square of soft glass silk of many colors. Then he pronounced a few cuss words, laughed at himself for getting so serious, shrugged, and with the casualness of Hopper with his pockets loaded, moved toward the wreck area, which was some distance off. It was night over this part of rapidly growing Palestine. Moving along a lighted causeway, he saw the man with the shovel teeth. Glory! Had he managed to survive so long? His mere presence here seemed like a signal of the end of peace. Nelsen and Ramos used to practice close contact tactics at 0G in space, so Nelsen didn't even wait for the man to notice him. He leaped and sped like an arrow, thudding into the guy's stomach with both his boot heels. Shovel Teeth was hurled 50 yards backwards, Nelsen hurling with him all the way. Unless Nelsen wanted to kill him, there wasn't any more to do. Partial revenge. He wasn't worried about anybody except the guy's jolly lad henchman. There was nobody close by. Now he did a quick fade, sure that nobody had seen who he was during the entire episode. No use to call the cops. There were too many uncertainties about the setup in wild, polyglot Palestine. Nelsen moved on to the wreck area. He didn't go into a garishly splendid place named the Second Stop. Thus, he didn't see its owner, whose identity he had already heard about, of course. Not that he wouldn't have liked to, but there wasn't any time to get involved in a long chat with a woman. Nor did he see the tall, skinny, horse-faced comic, known only as Igor, go through slapstick acrobatics that once would have been impossible. By a roundabout route, he proceeded to the catapults, where Gimp Hines was waiting for him. They had been conversing just a short while ago. "Did you drop in on Eileen?" Gimp asked right away. "No, there'll be other occasions," Nelsen laughed. "Someday, if we live, she'll own all the joints in the solar system." "Uh-huh, I'd bet on it. By the way, there's a grapevine yarn around. Somebody kicked Fanshawe, the jolly lad big shot, in the belly. You, perhaps?" "Don't listen to gossip," Nelsen said primly. "Are you serious about going to Mercury?" "Of course. There are people to take over my office duties. I'll be on my way in a couple of weeks. I think you'd like to come along, Frank." Nelsen felt an urge that was like crying for freedom. "Sure I would, but I'm bound to the wheel. Cripes, though. Watch yourself, fella. Don't you get into a mess." "Hell, you're the mess specialist, Frank. Fanshawe isn't here for fun, and there's been that new trouble at home." A Tovey bub loaded with people and a stateside bub, both in orbit around the Earth, had collided. No survivors, but there was plenty of blaming and counter-blaming. Another dangerous incident. Glory, with all that massed destructive power there was, could luck really last forever? Frank Nelsen got back to Post 1 okay. But later, riding into Post 3, just in an Archer 6 with a couple of guards for company, he picked up a long-lost voice, falsely sweet, then savage at the end. "I'm a Jinx, aren't I, Frankie? A vulture. Nice and cavalier you are. I bet you hoped I was dead. Okay, sucker." Tiflin didn't even answer when Nelsen tried to beam him. Nelsen was able to save Post 3. The guards and most of the personnel were experienced and tough. They drove the Jolly Lads back and deflected some chunks of aimed and accelerated asteroid chips with new defense rockets. Joe Cusack at Post 7 wasn't so lucky, though Frank had tipped him off. Half of the post was scattered and pirated. 6 fellas and the wife of one of them, a bunch from Baltimore, were just drying shreds that drifted in the wreckage. Big Joe, though he had a rocket chip through his chest, had been able to beat off the attackers with the help of a few asteroid hoppers and his novice crew, which turned out to be more rugged than some people might have expected. Frank got to him just as it was over, except for the cursing, the masculine tears of grief and rage, the promise of revenge. Luckily, none of the women had been captured. Joe Cusack, full of new antibiotics and coagulants, was still up and around. "So we knocked off a few of them, Frank," he said ruefully in his office bub. "Several were in Toby armor. Runaways or agents, they're crowding us, boy. Hell, what a junk heap this post is going to be to sort out." "Get to it," Nelsen commented. "You've got something in mind?" "Uh-huh. Coming in, I heard somebody address somebody else as Fan. Fanshaw, that would be. And I kind of remembered his voice as he cracked out orders. He was with this group. I'm going after him." "Good night. I'll send some of my crowd along." "Nope, Joe. They'd spot 2 or more guys. One they wouldn't even believe in. This is a lone wolf deal. Besides, it's personal. Shucks, I don't even think there's a risk." There he knew he exaggerated, especially as, huddled up to resemble a small asteroid fragment, he followed the retreating specks. His only weapon was a rapid-fire launcher using small rockets loaded only with chemical explosive. He felt a tingle all through him. Scare? All right. Ahead, as he expected, he saw 3 stolen bubs blossom out. There'd be a real pirates' party, like he had seen once. They'd have a lookout posted, of course, but the enormity of the belt made them cocky. Who could ever really police very much of it? One other advantage was that Jolly Lads were untidy. Around the distant bubs floated a haze of jettisoned refuse. Boxes, wrappings, shreds of stellene. Nelsen had figured on that. Decelerating, he draped a sheet of synthetic cellulose they had brought along, loosely over his armored shape. Then he drifted unobtrusively close. At a half-mile distance, he peered through the telescope sight of his launcher. The bubs were close together. The lookout floated free. Him he got first, with a careful homing shot. Immediately, he fired a burst into each bub, saw them collapse around their human contents. The men inside were like cats in limp bags, the exits of which could no longer be found. Calmly, he picked the biggest lump of struggling forms and fired again and again until there was no more motion left except an even rotation. He soon located Fanshaw. His unarmored body was bloated and drying, his mouth gapped, his shovel teeth were exposed to the stars and the distant naked sun. Nelsen had to think back to 6 dead young men and girls to keep from feeling lousy. Had Fanshaw just been another guy invading a region that was too big and terrible for humans? With something like dread, Nelsen looked for Tiflin too, but of course that worthy wasn't around. Nelsen picked up some space fitness cards. Quite a few nations were represented. Joe would have to turn in the cards to the respective authorities. Noting its drift course, Nelsen left the wreckage and hurried back to Post 7 before other Jolly Lads could catch up and avenge their pals. "Fanshaw's group will fight it out for a new leader, Joe," he said. "That should keep them busy for a while." Succeeding months were quieter, but the Tovies had lost no advantage. They had Ceres, the biggest of the asteroids, and their colonies were moving in on more and more others that were still untouched, closing them against all agreements to any competition. The new Archer 7, which Nelsen presently acquired, had a miniature TV screen set in its collar. Afield, he was able to pick up propaganda broadcasts from Ceres. They showed neat, orderly quarters, good food, good facilities, everything done by command and plan. He wondered glumly if that was better for men who were pitted against space. The rigid discipline sheltered them. They didn't have to think in a medium that might be too huge for their brains and emotions. Maybe it was more practical than rough and tumble individualism. He had a bitter picture of the whole solar system without a free mind in its whole extent, that is, if another gigantic blow-up didn't happen first. Nelsen didn't see Ramos's new bub, nor did he see him leave for Saturn and its moons. The guy had avoided him and gone secretive. But over a year later, the news reached Nelsen at Post 8. A man named Miguel Ramos had got back, more dead than alive, after a successful venture alone to the immediate vicinity of the ringed planet. His vehicle was riddled. He was in a Palestine hospital. Frank Nelsen delegated his duties and went to see Ramos. The guy seemed hardly more than half conscious. He had no hands left. His legs were off at the knee. Frostbite. Only the new antibiotics he had taken along had kept the gangrene from killing him. There was a light safety belt across his bed. But somehow he knew Nelsen, and his achievement seemed like a mechanical record fixed in his mind. "Hi, Frank," he whispered, hurriedly. "I figured it right. Out there, near Saturn, clusters of particles of frozen methane gas are floating free like tiny meteors. The instrumented rockets didn't run into them, and they were too light to show clearly on radar. But a bub with a man in it is a lot bigger and can be hit and made like a sieve. That's what happened to those who went first. Their Archers were pierced too. I had mine specially armored, with a heavy helmet and body plating. The particles just got my gloves and my legs. Cripes, I've got pictures right from the rim of the rings, and lots of data." Ramos showed the shadow of a reckless grin of triumph. Then he passed out. Later, Nelsen saw the photographs and the refrigerated box with the clear plastic sides. Inside it was what looked like dirty, granular snow, frozen water, which was all it was, unless the fact that it was also the substance of Saturn's rings made a difference. Saturn, another of the great, cold, largely gaseous planets, where it would perhaps always be utterly futile for a man to try to land. Ramos, the little Mex who chased the girls. Ramos, the hero, the historical figure now. Cursing under his breath, Nelsen wandered vaguely to the second stop. There he saw what probably every spaceman had dreamed of. Lucette of Paris, swimming nude in a gigantic dewdrop, possible where gravity was almost nil. Music played, beams of colored light swung majestically with prismatic effects through the great flattened, shimmering ovoid of water, while Lucette's motions completed a beautiful legend. Two figures moved past Nelsen in the darkened interior. The first one was tall and lean. Then he saw the profile of a lean face with a bent nose, heard a mocking, apologetic "uh-oh," and didn't realize that this was Tiflin, the harbinger of misfortune, before it was too late to collar him. Nelsen followed as soon as he could push his way from the packed house, but pursuit was hopeless in the crowded causeway outside. A few minutes later, he was in Eileen Sands' apartment. It was not his first visit. Eileen seldom danced or sang anymore, herself. She was different now. She wore an evening dress, soft, blue, tasteful. Here she was the cool, poised owner, the lady. "Tiflin hasn't been around here for a long time, Frank," she was saying. "You know that his buddy entertained for me for a while. I have an interested nature, but Tiflin never gave me anything but wisecracks. There are a lot of Tovies around. There's even a center for runaways. I don't ask questions of customers usually, and technically all I can require of a comic is talent. This Igor had a certain kind. What is the difficulty now?" Frank Nelson looked at Eileen almost wearily for a second. "Just that Tiflin is somehow involved with most of the bad luck I've ever had out here," he said grimly. "And if Pallastown were destroyed, everybody but the Tovies might as well go home from the Belt. The timing seems to me to be about right. They'd risk it, feeling we're too scared to strike back at home. The Jolly Lads, who are international, could be encouraged to do the job for them." Sudden hollows showed in Eileen's cheeks. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing much for me to do," he answered. "I only happened to notice, while I was coming into Pallas, that all the guard stations, extending way out, were quietly very alert. But is that enough? Well, if they can't cope with an attack, what good am I? We're vulnerable here. I guess we just sit tight and wait." She smiled faintly. "All right, let's. Sit, relax, converse. Stop being the important personage for a while, Frank." "Look who's talking. Okay. What do you know that's new to tell?" "A few things. I keep track of most everybody." He took her slender hand, brown in his angular fist that was pale from his space gloves. "GIMP first," he said. "Still on Mercury with 2 and 2. 2 and 2 was a bricklayer, a good beginning for a construction man. That seems to be paying off as colonists move in. GIMP is setting up solar power stations." "Encouraging information for once. Here's a hard one. Jig Hollis, the real intelligent man who stayed home. I've envied him for years." Yes, Frank. Intelligent, maybe. But he never quite believed it, himself. His wife stayed with him, even after he turned real sour and reckless. One night he hit a big oak tree with his car. Now he is just as dead as if he had crashed into the sun at 50 miles per second. He couldn't take knowing that he was scared to do what he wanted. "Hell," Nelson said flatly. "Now, who else should I gossip about?" Eileen questioned. "Oh, yes, Harv Diamond, hero of our lost youth, who got space fatigue. Well, he recovered and returned to active duty in the USSF, which perhaps leaves me with just my own love life to confess." She smiled lightly. "Once there was a kid named Frankie Nelson, who turned out to be a very conscientious jerk. Since then there have been scads of rugged, romantic characters on all sides. You're going to ask about Miguel Ramos?" She paused, looked unhappy and tired. "The celebrity," she said, "mashed up. But he'll recover, this time. I've seen him, sent him flowers, sat beside him. But what do you do with a clown like that? Lock him in a closet, or look at him through a telescope? Goodbye, hello, goodbye. A kid with gaudy banners flying, if he lives to be 40, which he never will. They'll be giving him artificial hands and feet, and he'll be trying for Pluto. A friend, I guess. I'm proud. That's all. Anything else you want to know?" "Yes, there was a cute little girl at Serene." "Jenny Harper. She married one of those singing moon prospectors. Somebody murdered them both, way out on the far side." Frank Nelson's mouth twisted. "That's enough, pal," he said. "I'd better go do my sitting tight someplace else. Keep your Archer handy. Thanks, and see you." Within 40 minutes, David Lester was showing him some pictures that a hopper had brought in from a vault in a surface asteroid. On the screen, great mottled shapes moved through a lush forest. Thousands of tiny, flitting, bat-like creatures, miniature pterodactyls of the terrestrial age of reptiles, hovered over a swamp where millions of insects hung like motes in the light of the low sun. A much larger pterodactyl, far above, glided gracefully over a cliff and out to sea, its long, beaked head turning watchfully. "Hey," Nelson said mildly, as his jaded mind responded. Lester nodded. They were on Earth, too, as the Martians must have been, exploring and taking pictures during the Cretaceous period. Oh, there's a perhaps even better sequence. Like the Martians, they had a world-wrecking missile which they were building in space. Spherical, about 6 miles in diameter, I calculate. Shall I show you? No, I think I'll toddle over to the offices, Les. Keep wearing those Archers, people. Glad the kid likes to play in his." Nelson had donned his own 7, with the helmet fastened across his chest by a strap. At the KRNH office there was a letter which luckily hadn't been sent out to Post 8. The tone was more serious than that of any that Nance Codiss had sent before. "Dear Frank, I'm actually coming your way. I'll be stopping to work at the Survey Station Hospital on Mars for about 2 months en route." He read that far when he heard the sirens and saw the flashes of defending batteries that were trying to ward off missiles from Palestine. He latched his helmet in place. He was headed for the underground galleries when the first impacts came. He saw 4 domes vanish in flashes of fire. Then he didn't run anymore. He had his small rocket launcher from the office. If they ever came close enough... But of course, they stayed thousands of miles off. He got to the nearest fallen dome as fast as he could. Everybody had been in armor, but there were over 100 dead. Emergency and rescue crews were operating efficiently. He glanced around for indications. No explosive, chemical or nuclear had yet been used. But there was the old Jolly Lad trick. Accelerate a chunk of asteroid material to a speed of several miles per second by grasping it with your gloved hands while the shoulder ionic of your armor was at full power. Start at a great distance, aim your missile with your body, let it go. Impact would be sheer, blasting incandescence. A few hundred chunks of raw metal could finish Palestine. Were these just crazy wild slobs whooping it up, or real crud provided with a purpose and reward? Either way, here was the eternal danger to any Belt settlement. Nelson could have tried to reach an escape exit into open space, but he helped with the injured while he waited for more impacts to come. There was another series of deflecting flashes from the defensive batteries. 2 more domes vanished. Then, somehow, nothing more. Evidently, some of the attackers had been only half-hearted this time. Reprieve. Almost 400 people were dead. It could have been the whole town. Then spreading disaster. All Nelson's friends were okay. The posts called in, okay too. Nelson waited 3 days. He wanted to help defend if the attack was renewed. But now the UNSF was concentrating in the vicinity. For a while, things would be quiet out here. Just the same, he felt kind of fed up. He felt as if the end of everything he knew had crept inevitably a little closer. He beamed Mars, the survey station. He contacted Nance. He had known that she should have arrived already. He was relieved. He knew what the region between here and there could be like when there was trouble. "It's me, Frank Nelson, Nance," he said into his helmet phone as he stood beyond the outskirts of the town, on the barren, glittering surface of Pallas. "I'm still wearing the sweater. Stay where you are. I've never been on Mars either, but I'll be there soon." His old uncertainties about talking to her evaporated now that he was doing it. "For Pete's sake, Frank," he heard her laugh happily, still sounding like the neighbor kid. "Gosh, it's good to hear you." He left for Post 1 soon after that. Nowadays, it was almost a miniature of the ever more magnificent, if insecure, Palestine. He kept thinking angrily of Art Kuzak, getting a little overstuffed, it seemed. The hunky kid, the ex-football player, who had become a big commercial and industrial baron of the Belt. Easy living, cuties around. And poor Twin Joe, just another stooge. Nelson went into the office, his fist clenched overdramatically. "I'm taking a leave, Art. Maybe a long one," he said. Art Kuzak stared at him. "You damned independent bums. You too, Nelson?" He began to growl, but when he saw Nelson's jaw harden, he got the point and grinned instead. "Okay, Frank. Nobody's indispensable. I might do the same when you come back. Who knows?" Frank Nelson joined a KRNH bub convoy, earthbound, but also passing fairly close to Mars within a few hours. End of Chapter 6, Part 2.